All right, good afternoon to you. 406 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up this hour from FreedomWorks, Adam Brandon will join us. We'll talk about what is going on in the spending fight in Washington. That's heating up again. The shutdown showdown is back. And we'll also talk about what it'll take for Republicans to win big in 2024. Adam has some ideas on that. Julie Kelly will also join us coming up at 5:30 with an update on all of that January 6 footage that you and I have yet to see. What's the deal there? Julie with some news to share with us today. You can chat with us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. That is where we find Phil in Fredericksburg patiently waiting. Phil, good afternoon. You are on the Vince Coglianese Show, sir.
Hey, Vince. Look, I was driving up to Charlestown, West Virginia, and I turned on the radio in my car, and I heard you say, and it's Labor Day, and I went, this must be recorded. So I called the station. I said, there's no way Corey's going to pick up. And Corey picked up. I said, what in the Samuel L. Jackson is going on?
Hey, Phil, it's an elaborate stunt. This is actually all pre-recorded, but we knew what you would say, so we're responding with the recordings.
That's awesome. Hey, look, I just wanted to say, sympathies with the last caller about the unions. The American auto industries are getting hammered with these electric cars that are making, like, for example, Ford has made no money on their electric cars. And
Right.
Without profit, you don't stay in business.
Yeah, they started cutting the price on that F-150 Lightning because they're having trouble getting rid of them.
God, what a nightmare that truck is. When they start towing something with that, it gets a range of about 5 feet. So,
Man.
I mean, but the thing is, I just wanted to say that we need to find a way to get to the Democratic voter and tell them, look, these are not Democrats that are running your party now. These are paid communist operatives. You got to come to the Republican side. You got to vote for the Constitution. Please don't vote for children getting cut. Don't vote for all this money going out of the country to places we can't even track where it's going. And this president we have is a criminal. He's an absolute criminal. And they're transferring everything he's done to Donald Trump, who's done none of it.
Right.
And Biden is an absolute piece of human slime. We've got to get these people out of office. I'm just begging the Republican Party to find a way to get to the American Democrat and say, look, we need your help. That's all I'm saying. We need the American Democrat to vote with us so we can get these people out of the White House.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know what it's going to take, Phil, because look, think of all the things that the impositions, like the really obvious stuff. You don't have to follow the news super closely. But when they say they want to ban your gas stove, like who's for that exactly? When they ban your light bulbs, as they just did, they're banning incandescent bulbs in the United States. Who is for this? Biden's alcohol czar coming out a week or so ago and saying that we may need to switch to 2 beers a week as the national guideline. I'm sorry, that guy must not live during the Biden administration. My intake has had to go up since Joe Biden's been in office. We've got a Coke here, Phil, and on and on. And now here's another one for you. You talk about these electric vehicles. Have you seen what the left is doing lately? They're now saying that the electric vehicles are also very damaging to the environment. And it turns out you're not allowed to use either an internal combustion engine or a golf cart. You're not allowed to use either one of these things. Because they're too damaging to the environment. So what does that leave you with? That leaves you with government transportation. That's what they want to put you on.
Yeah. Control all of us and everywhere we go. Yep.
Everywhere we go. I hope our lefty friends find out about this and actually ingest it and process it rationally.
Labor Day, Vince.
Yeah.
Okay, God bless you and God bless Corey and everybody.
Thanks so much, Phil. Thank you very much for your calls as always. Really appreciate that. On this point, on the fact that the left wants to get you out of your vehicle, no matter what powers it, whether it's a Tesla or a traditional Ford F-150 with an internal combustion engine, Pete Buttigieg wants you to stop driving cars, is the headline today from Town Hall. Sarah Arnold on the byline here. And she writes, no gas stoves, no gas-powered cars, and no beer are just a few things the Biden administration has put the kibosh on. The Democrat-controlled White House is now fear-mongering Americans into believing that all cars cause climate change and promote racism and should therefore be banned. You following this logic? I love how the left's rules change moment by moment. They were telling us the future, the great future we're all going towards is we'll all be in electric vehicles. It's going to be amazing. No carbon emissions anywhere. Excuse me, where does the power come from? Shut your mouth. You're not allowed to ask that question. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg appointed an Obama-era group made up of 24 leading experts to advise him on, quote, transportation equity. If I say the word equity again, I'm going to barf. This word equity means racial prejudice, just to be super clear on what the synonyms are for equity. Buttigieg claims that the privilege of owning a car ignites, quote, systemic racism and should be banned because of vehicles' negative impacts on the environment. Members of the Advisory Committee on Transportation Equity include spatial policy scholar. This can't be real. Someone calls themselves a spatial policy scholar. Don't we just call them decorators? A spatial policy scholar? I think there's plenty of room on this wall for a painting. Andrea Marpolero Colomina is her name. She's a spatial policy scholar. She says, quote, all cars are bad. Okay. This is a woman who's on a government advisory committee for the transportation department. She says, quote, all cars are bad. And she calls for, quote, zero emission transit. Honey, where does the power come from for this? Zero emission transit? How do we generate power for zero emission transit? Please explain. And speak slowly so we can understand. However, she told the Free Beacon, the great Washington Free Beacon, that she's, quote, not advocating for a complete erasure of cars, but hopes to convince Buttigieg to redirect the United States from relying on private motor vehicles. What? Veronica Davis also claimed cars are the, quote, problem and divide communities because, according to her, vehicles are a status symbol that only privileged white people own. It's kind of a racist assumption. This isn't anti-car propaganda, but vehicles have wreaked havoc on the environment and communities, Davis said, according to her book about inclusive transportation. Quote, racism shaped the urban and suburban areas where even today we see the residual effects. Scrapped by the Trump administration, the committee will advise Buttigieg on promising practice to institutionalize equity into agency programs, policies, regulations, and activities. That is, once again, to use racial prejudice in all of these assessments. And racial prejudice means not making sure that everyone has access to cars. It means too many white people own cars, therefore nobody should have a car. That's their position. Is that crazy? Yeah, it's fully insane. It's full-blown nuts. And these people are actually in charge of things. Also, let me go back to this other thing that Andrea Marpolero Colomina said, the spatial policy scholar, that she's not advocating for a complete erasure of cars. She just wants to get rid of private motor vehicles. Well, I see how this works again. So normal people don't get to have cars, but government officials get to have 40-car motorcades. That's what that means. That Sheila Jackson Lee will still be allowed to have her driver take her to and from her home on Capitol Hill. That's just, I think it's like a block away from the building. She gets a chauffeur in a government paid for vehicle that takes her to and fro. You don't get to drive to work. You don't get to take your kids on vacation in a car. You don't get to drive your kid to school. No more of that for you in Pete Buttigieg's world, because spatial policy scholars have been telling him that, quote, all cars are bad and we need zero emission transit. And I'm not advocating for the complete erasure of cars. I just want to get rid of private motor vehicles. It's kind of the John Kerry private jet rule, isn't it? Where none of us can fly in planes. You're not flying in a plane to visit your grandmother? You're a world destroyer. You're the reason a hurricane just hit Florida, visiting your grandmother. Who do you think you are? Meanwhile, John Kerry is allowed to fly private to spread the good word that you flying commercial is bad for the world. It's bad for the planet. Wow. In 2021, Town Hall continues, President Joe Biden issued an executive order that required federal agencies to, quote, pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all. The agency reportedly has to conduct a, quote, equity assessment to identify policies that create, quote, systemic barriers for minority communities. So how does that work? how does you owning a car create a systemic barrier for a minority community? What if the you I'm speaking to right now is a, quote, minority? how does you as a minority having a vehicle cause a systemic barrier for minority communities? None of this even makes sense. It's not supposed to. In January, Buttigieg promoted a climate plan to reduce, quote, commuting miles through a, quote, increase in remote work and virtual engagements. That is, tether you to your closet. You have to stay locked in your high-rise. Quote, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted major opportunities for telework. You see how they talk about this? So your suffering creates opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted major opportunities for telework, the plan states, with some studies showing the possibility of 10% long-term reduction in annual vehicle miles traveled. Less traveling means less freedom and means more government power. Along with several other things, the Biden administration has advocated for Americans to purchase electric vehicles to push their radical new Green Deal. Although, of course, as I noted earlier in the article, they don't think electric vehicles are good anymore. They now say that the minerals required to build each battery for an electric vehicle are so destructive for the environment and emit so many carbon emissions, so much CO2, carbon dioxide, being put into the atmosphere that it might actually be worse. They actually say this now. I think it was the Washington Post a couple weeks ago. They said the electric vehicles might be worse than the internal combustion engine because the EVs don't last as long. And you have to replace the batteries. Eventually, your battery runs out, and you've got to replace it. And it turns out the internal combustion engine may be more efficient for the environment. They didn't think it through, did they? Steve is calling in from Ashburn now. Steve, you're on the Vince Coglianese Show. Hello, sir. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Vince. Great show, great subject. So, so much of this is leading by example. I was just out at Monterey, all the big car shows going on out there. There are companies now that are converting older sports cars to electric.
Steve, hold on a second, because I know I'm having trouble understanding you, so my suspicion is the audience is definitely having trouble. If you're on speakerphone, can you switch to the handset?
No, I'm not on speaker.
Oh, okay, you're on the handset. All right, just maybe get it a little closer. Let's try again.
Okay, so can you hear me better now?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so I think that our leadership ought to lead by example.
Yes.
I was just out recently at all the car shows at Monterey, and there's several companies now that are converting sports cars, even older sports cars, from internal combustion to electric. So why doesn't Joe take his car to one of these companies and convert his classic 67 Corvette to electric? Lead by example, Joe.
I don't think, see, here's the problem with that idea, Steve. I don't think that those electric conversion companies have the security clearance necessary to filter through all the classified documents sitting in the seats of that Corvette. I think that'll be the problem with this particular arrangement. But I totally agree with you. He should go first. Like, if he's going to force the rest of us to do it, turn that beautiful little Corvette into an electric vehicle, and then we'll start to buy in.
There you go. I completely agree. Let's see if he'll do it.
Yeah, no chance in hell. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. He loves that Corvette. He's, that his true loyalties are to that Corvette, and whatever income stream Hunter Biden's generating at any given moment. It's 4:20 now. All right, Anthony Fauci is still out there and schmoozing with all the cable networks. He wasn't ready for this conversation this weekend. CNN's Michael Smerconish had him on and confronted him about masks just being a complete joke. They don't work.
There is a perception out there by many, how many I don't know, that they don't work and that the data concludes that they didn't work in the first go-round. Respond to that on masks.
Yeah, well, that's not so. I mean, when you're talking
is.
about at the population level, that the data are less strong than knowing that if you look on a situation as an individual
Scam artist.
protecting themselves or protecting them from spreading it, there's no doubt that masks work. Different studies give different percentages of advantage of wearing it, but there's no doubt that the weight of the studies, and there have been many studies, indicate the benefit of wearing masks.
What?
I'm going to refer to one of them. You've heard about it before. I heard about it from a number of radio callers. Brett Stevens in the Times talked about Cochrane. Put that on the screen. The most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is the lead author, were unambiguous. There is just no evidence that masks, make any difference. He told the journalist Mayan Damasi, full stop. But wait, hold on. What about the N95 masks as opposed to the lower quality surgical or cloth masks? Makes no difference. None of it, he said. Well, what about the studies that initially persuaded policymakers to impose mask mandates? They were convinced by non-randomized studies, flawed observational studies. How do we get beyond that finding of that particular review?
Yeah, Fauci, how?
Yeah, but there are other studies, Michael, that show at an individual level for individual. When you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong. But when you talk about...
In other words, there was no benefit.
It's an individual basis of someone protecting themselves or protecting themselves from spreading it to others. There's no doubt that there are many studies that show that there is an advantage.
Sometimes it works if you put yourself in a vehicle and close the doors and lock them up and shut off the air conditioning and put a mask on and then put toilet paper around your face. There's no chance that somebody in a different state is going to catch COVID from you. Okay, thanks, Fauci. That's very compelling.
It took at the broad population level, like the Cochrane study. The data are less firm with regard to the effect on the overall pandemic. But
that's a euphemism for admitting that you're a big, fat, stinking liar. The data are less firm on the thing that I was telling everyone to do. Yeah, you should have never been in that job. You should have been fired so very long ago. And this is only further evidence of that. Thank you to a CNN host for actually bringing up that study, albeit, what, 2 years too late? 429. Welcome back to the Vince Coglianese Show, and it's that time of year again. We are hurtling towards another government shutdown unless Democrats and Republicans can get together and agree on how much money the federal government is going to spend. My next guest says the government should spend less. He's the president of FreedomWorks, and he joins us now. Adam Brandon is on the phone. Hello, Adam.
Hey, thanks very much for joining. I think on this holiday weekend, it's such an important thing to talk about.
Yeah, that's for sure. So I remember when Kevin McCarthy became Speaker of the House, he did it with a commitment to the other Republicans that he would have all of these clean spending bills and they would restrain the excess spending of the federal government, which has actually made Americans so much poorer today than they were just a few short years ago. How do you assess how things are going in Congress now?
Well, it does seem to be like an annual thing that we have shutdowns. I remember a few years ago, it was a bigger deal when you'd have a government shutdown. But look, if most government continues to function, your Social Security checks continue to get to move. So even when you have a shutdown, you're really only shutting down about 20% of the government. So yeah, Jersey barriers will come up around the monuments, but outside of that, it's really not going to affect people as much as a shutdown people would think it would. But what we're dealing with right now is the government's debt is $32 trillion. But in 10 years, that debt is going to be over $50 trillion. So right now, you can even argue it's too much, but we're rapidly heading into an era where we're going to be piling up $2 trillion a year. This isn't a political thing. This is a moral thing. At some point, you just got to say enough. And at some point, you've got to deal with the problem. So what I see is Republicans sending a message to McCarthy saying, let's send the best, strongest, most reasonable set of cuts we can to reset the debate with Joe Biden and the Senate Democrats, because at some point someone has to do something about the trajectory of this debt.
Yeah, absolutely. But we are headed into a big presidential election year. Do you get the sense that Republicans are nervous to do something like cut government spending when they think that they're going to face attacks from the left for doing that?
I was reading an article from Ohio the other day, and it was after the initiative failed in the state of Ohio, and one of the Democrats who was interviewed said, there are new rules. We just don't know what they are yet. And I think that spending is one of those rules. Everyone always assumes, okay, spending, there's no constituent in America that wants to see spending cut.
Right.
Well, look, Americans aren't stupid. I think they know this $50 trillion that's coming is going to be, it's not going to be just the rich who pay that debt. It's going to be all of us. And you're going to pay for it both in taxes, but you're also going to pay for it in crushed dreams and missed opportunity. We already see what happens when interest rates go up, how it throttles the opportunity to potentially start a new business, get a new house, even for younger people to move out of their parents' basement.
For sure.
It just becomes more difficult. Now multiply that many, many times if we are living in a $50 trillion world when interest rates would be catastrophically high.
Well,
so
one of
I
the
think
things
the rules are different.
Yeah,
the
for
rules are
sure.
different. I think you can.
And one of the things that I think has changed, Adam, is because of the explosion in inflation over these last few years. I think Americans see a direct causal link between all the money that the Federal Reserve printed, all of the money that the federal government spent, and how much poorer we all are as a result. A lot more money in the economy, but that dollar is not going as far, and people are in real terms poorer than they were before Biden took office.
If you go back to 2019, if you go back to right before COVID and we had that nice boom in the economy, it was a private sector boom. After the tax cuts came in, you had a lot of people making investments. A lot of people had job opportunities and growth opportunities. Since COVID, you've had public sector investment. And the problem with public sector is it doesn't have the same disciplines, the same market in private sector investment. Right. And that's one of the reasons you get inflation is money flows quickly in certain places. When the money is coming from the private sector, you don't have that problem. The market will discipline where the money goes.
Yeah, just a lot of sugar highs, nothing sustainable in the long term. And in fact, people are hurting as a result of it. Okay, so the spending bill debate is continuing, as I mentioned. One of the things that I would like to see these Republicans do is to punish the elements of the federal government that are abusing their power by defunding them. If you're looking for places to defund, I would start with areas of the United States Department of Justice, areas of the intel community. I mean, there is a big platter from which to choose, a big menu of items from which to choose that you could begin defunding now, and that's the power these Republicans have.
That is the power, and I think one of the most important strategic things to remember is that there used to be this adage when a shutdown would happen, well, it doesn't, at least the bureaucrat or the government's not spending money anymore. Well, what's changed in recent times is when Congress fails to do its job, the bureaucrats run amok. And so what we've seen is that the Washington doesn't really care if you shut down because they're all on autopilot doing their thing anyway.
Right.
And so Congress if you go back to the Constitution, they are chartered to do oversight of these bureaucracies. Not the president isn't chartered to oversee these bureaucracies, he just executes. But it comes to Congress, who controls the purse strings, to decide who and what we're spending money on in the United States.
I have seen some conversation in the political media that Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, he keeps bringing up the issue of launching an impeachment inquiry into Biden, and that could happen apparently this month. And one of the claims that's being made is that this is a useful distraction from him failing to keep his promise to have 12 spending bills, clean ones, done this month in September. What do you make of that? Do you think that the impeachment conversation is designed to be a distraction from failing to meet the spending commitments that Kevin McCarthy made?
Look, I think there's a lot, and we're just talking about oversight. There's some really weird things coming out about Hunter Biden, and
For sure.
I'm just kind of scratching my head about all of that. So I do think there is a right place to have some oversight and some conversations there. But I tend to agree with that sentiment, actually, that Biden impeachment to me is not a main focus, getting these bills done and getting these cuts. That's what I think Americans are going to see that as very serious policy. And if you're going to try and hold this House in 2024, you got to show the American people what you can do. And it almost seems desperate to me to start shifting over to Biden impeachment. And we're about to be in the presidential cycle. Go do your hard work and let's show Americans that you can actually cut the budget without all the draconian fear mongering that you'll hear from the left. Like, let's go and have a reasonable adult conversation about spending. That's what I think That is good public policy.
Yeah.
And that is good public policy that will make good policy.
Well, and I don't want people to be left with the wrong impression in my assessment here. I do think that they should move into an impeachment phase just to give them more investigative powers. That's the claim they're making. And that I think that's useful. I think we've got evidence of corruption everywhere with Joe Biden and his family. But I do think that there may be some utility in talking about impeachment that Kevin McCarthy has here in terms of avoiding some of the more difficult conversations on spending. And on that conversation on spending, I think connecting it more directly, Adam, Brandon, to people's lives and the fact that they're worse off right now will go a long way. I mean, look at the numbers. You've got half the country says that they're worse off this year than they were last year. That's in the Biden era. You've got well over 60% who say they're now living paycheck to paycheck. You have Americans at $1 trillion in credit card debt and climbing. The economic picture right now is bleak. And if Republicans can connect their spending cut efforts in that House to what Americans are feeling at home and say, hey, look, we're coming to the rescue, they could actually make some real electoral victories here.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing up that point about credit cards. I brought this up in previous interviews myself, where what you start seeing is to make ends meet. It's not that people are adjusting their lifestyles yet. They're just turning to the plastic to make that gap. But that's temporary. And what that means is at some point here, especially, and God forbid people run up their credit cards to a point that it starts really affecting their lives. But even if you have to use credit cards to make your ends meet, sooner or later, you're going to have to cut things back. And when that happens, that's a hard thing for Americans to do, to start cutting back their lifestyle, just because basic necessities from food to kids going to school, the new clothes are more expensive. And then that does have a political impact at some point. This morning I was reading an article about this change in Germany right now, and they're calling it a green lash, because in German politics, what you're seeing is a country that is so relied on green policy and economic policy that has driven costs up to the point that now the German public are finally saying, enough, we need relief. We need to get our consumer power back. Same thing is happening here.
Yeah, unquestionably. And it is really detrimental to people's lives. On this same issue, economics, it's not really a partisan issue. If you're suffering, you're suffering, and you're going to look for relief. You do have a column out this past week in Newsweek, and you write, headline, "To win, the GOP must reach out to independents." Talk about what you mean here as we go into 2024.
This, to me, is there's two major shifts going on in American politics right now. And the one is that and this is kind of one of those stories that's as old as time in politics, but it is kind of been more, let's say, refocused on. And that is, if you're going to keep the House of Representatives, there's really only about 30 swing districts in the country. Out of 435 districts, about 200 will be Republican, 200 will be Democrat. It's those 35 or so in the middle that you have to win. And they are all in suburban areas. And one thing that's very interesting to me on that is the demographic shift we're going into right now. The majority of voters this upcoming cycle are going to be Generation X and the millennials. And I think too often people think that millennials are just getting out of college. The millennial voter is 40 years old, lives in the suburbs, and has bought a house and has a couple kids at this point.
Right.
And Republicans, that's not Republican strong. They haven't made strong inroads into that demographic yet. And when I stop and just look at the numbers, just looking at the pure numbers, there's about 30% of the population is Republican or conservative, about 30% is liberal or Democrat, and that 40% independent. While they don't decide who wins a primary, they do decide who will win in November. And I believe the Republican message on strong economics and spending, I believe that's the message that you need to deliver to go and start to win those independent suburban voters.
Because strong economics is really kind of a who can disagree with this message.
Well, but these people in the suburbs know that when they see all the spending, they know this is coming out of their taxes in the future. And so this is what we were talking about earlier. I think things are different. I think the American voter is smarter than most politicians think they are. And so you look at the college bailout, for all the student loans, I thought it was shocking how many young millennials in the suburbs rejected that. Well, when you think about it, it's most of those folks, they're the ones who have paid their student loans back or are struggling to pay their student loans back. And they all know friends and relatives who got a degree that's worth $200,000 in some kind of, esoteric studies that will not pay for itself. And so they see that person, working at Starbucks and getting their loans paid off for free when they're struggling to pay for their kids, college.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, millennials are either done with their loans or they're at the very end of their payments right now. And so they're looking at this going, boy, this is a very unfair arrangement.
Because they're paying for it no matter what. And I think that's kind of if Republicans could be the adults in the room on spending and the economy, it will do well in these few swing districts that determine who controls Congress. And I think right now we're going to focus on the primaries, and then I still think Joe Biden's dropping out. I can't believe he's really actually going to run.
Yeah.
And I think that just sets it up for next year, your arguments next year from now, when you start wrapping the summer up, when you start focusing on presidential politics and House politics, I think that economic story, who's going to be stronger on that, will end up being the victor.
Yeah, and Biden's been so abysmal on it, all the more reason why he'll probably not be the nominee. They're going to need somebody who's a blank slate for that. Adam Brandon, president of FreedomWorks, thank you very much for spending some time on your Labor Day with us. We really appreciate it. Well, as you know, Joe Biden is constantly in between his many vacations. I think by some estimates, he's spent about 40% of his presidency so far on vacation. Now, I don't actually have a problem with him being away from the White House. You and I both know that he's not even running the country anyway, somebody else is. But in the world where the president has a say and he's doing stuff, stop doing stuff. Go on vacation. If Biden was on vacation 90% of the time, I'd consider that a big success. Big success. I'd rather have him away from the office. So more vacation, please. Stop screwing up the country. But Joe Biden, constantly in between vacations. He was asked this week, upon the occasion of visiting Florida in the wake of last week's hurricane, hey, are you going to visit East Palestine, Ohio? Do you have any intention of actually ever visiting East Palestine? Remember, it was earlier this year that East Palestine, Ohio was wrecked by not only a train derailment, but by a government decision to burn off all of the chemicals that were on that train, thus poisoning the creatures and humans in the vicinity. And the White House was asked at one point, is he going to visit East Palestine? Is he going to see the wreckage that he caused? That's not actually the question that was asked, but that's at the core of it. And the White House said, yeah, of course. Oh, yeah, totally. He'll visit it. And guess what happened? Nothing. Nada. Zip. Zilch. No visit by the President of the United States. So in one of the few opportunities that reporters have these days to ask him questions on literally anything, one reporter did put to the President of the United States, hey, what about East Palestine? What's the deal? And here's Joe Biden's response.
I said in March that you would go to East Palestine, Ohio. You came here. How come you haven't gone to East Palestine yet?
Well, I haven't had the occasion to go to East Palestine. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I've got to pick out what drink I'm having the next day. I had a lot of sleeping going on, and, we're trying to catch up on Netflix. I have a couple shows I haven't watched yet.
Here, and I just haven't been able to break. I was thinking whether I'd go to East Palestine this week, but I then was reminded I've got...
Oh, please, that's hilarious. So he gets asked the question. He's like, it's so funny you asked that. I was contemplating going this very week. I was going to go tomorrow, actually.
But I then was reminded I've got to go literally around the world. I'm going from Washington to India to Vietnam.
I was reminded I have a major international trip scheduled that I forgot about that would get in the way of my ability to visit the people of the United States.
And so it's going to be a while. But
it's going to be a while.
We're making sure that East Palestine has...
Nobody knows how to say it. The people say East Palestine in Ohio. They say Palestine. Can you even remember the name? Not even the reporter knew the name. They both said Palestine, East Palestine.
Has what they need materially in order to deal with their problems.
Come on. So once again, an up yours from the President of the United States to the good people of Ohio. And you know why he's not going. You know why. A bridge collapses in Philly. Biden's there lickety-split. He's there in a moment's notice because of Democrats. Oh, whose voters are they? They're yours, Mr. President. I'm on the way. Whose voters are they in East Palestine, Ohio? Well, they're Trump's voters. Well, maybe we'll visit them. Never. Maybe we'll never visit them. That's the plan right now. from the White House. And I'm guessing at this point, the people of East Palestine are just like me. Please stay away. Stay on vacation. The last thing we need is a presidential visit. It's 4:58.